Some people walk into a room and feel the tension before a word is spoken. They notice the flicker in someone's eyes when they're lying. They sense when affection is forced, when confidence is only armor, when happiness hides quiet despair. And they wish they didn't. Because once you start seeing the truth beneath appearances, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending that everyone means what they say, or that emotions stay neatly inside the person feeling them. Carl Jung called this the differentiated intuitive function, a heightened form of perception that allows a person to perceive unconscious material in others. But he also called it dangerous, because clarity in the human world is not rewarded, it's punished. The clearer you see, the lonelier it gets. Jung wrote about people who could read a room without words, who noticed the silent communications that everyone else ignored. He realized that their suffering wasn't born from delusion. It came from perceiving too accurately, from being awake in a world that relies on shared sleep. One of his patients described it perfectly. She said, "It's as if everyone else is speaking in a dream language, and I can hear what they actually mean instead of what they say." It made her unbearable to others and unbearable to herself. Because what do you do when you can see the wounds everyone hides, but no one wants you to acknowledge them? When you can feel their anger, envy, or fear as if it were your own heartbeat? That's not a gift. That's a weight. And yet Jung saw something extraordinary beneath the suffering, a potential that could either destroy or evolve a person. Seeing everything, he realized, isn't a blessing or a curse. It's an unfinished stage of consciousness. The question is, will it consume you, or will you learn to use it? There's a story Jung told from his Red Book years, when his own mind nearly fractured under the flood of visions, symbols, and intuitions. He described feeling as if he were seeing into people's souls, but without control over what entered his awareness. He felt possessed by perception. He realized something essential. You can drown in other people's unconscious. Not metaphorically, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, drown. Because when you see too much, you stop knowing what's yours. Every emotion becomes contagious. Every hidden thought echoes in your mind. You stop being a person and start becoming a mirror. And mirrors don't survive long among the blind. Here's the first hidden cost of seeing everything: psychic absorption. Jung called it participation mystique, the dissolution of boundaries between the self and others. It means you start feeling other people's emotions as if they were your own. Their anxiety becomes your background noise. Their sadness, your shadow. Their anger, your guilt. At first, you think you're empathic. Then you realize you're just porous. Everywhere you go, you absorb something. You walk into a crowded room and leave with other people's ghosts in your chest. You can't explain why you feel heavy after certain conversations. You only know that being around some people drains you like they plugged into your nervous system without asking. And when you tell others, they call you sensitive. But Jung knew better. He saw that this was not weakness. It was overexposure. It's what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious. Because your psyche was never designed to process the emotions of an entire environment. It was designed to handle your own. The second cost, social rejection. Jung observed that when someone sees too clearly, they threaten the unconscious agreements that hold groups together. He wrote, "The individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective illusions upon which society depends." Think about that. Society survives by pretending. Families survive by overlooking. Relationships survive by mutual blindness. So when you show up and you can't help but notice what everyone else suppresses, the tension, the hypocrisy, the resentment, you become a disruption to the dream. People don't thank you for clarity. They resent you for breaking the spell. They accuse you of negativity. They tell you you're overanalyzing. They say you're too intense. What they really mean is, please stop making me conscious of what I'm trying to avoid. You become the mirror they can't bear to look into, and soon you start hiding your perception. You start pretending you don't notice, because you've learned the oldest survival rule of the sensitive. See everything. Say nothing. But the silence corrodes you from the inside, because your nature is to perceive truth, not to bury it. The third cost, identity erosion. When you're tuned into everyone else, you stop being tuned into yourself. You don't know if you're tired because you're tired or because the person next to you is depressed. You don't know if your opinions are yours or echoes of the people you absorb. You don't know where you end and others begin. Jung called this ego dissolution through unconscious identification. The intuitive person merges with the environment until individuality fades. You start living as the collective unconscious, a living receiver of everyone's emotional signals. And that's when the burnout begins. Not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that happens when your psyche is overloaded with signals it was never meant to interpret all at once. So why does this happen to some people? Jung believed that the intuitive function, especially introverted intuition, isn't just psychological. It's evolutionary. Some people are born with minds that act like early radar systems for consciousness. They sense what others can't yet process. They live on the edge of collective evolution. But evolution comes with side effects. They feel things before language catches up. They see the next stage of awareness while everyone else is still clinging to the last. To live like that is to live half in the future, half in the shadows. And yet Jung insisted, this suffering is not meaningless. It's developmental. It's consciousness trying to grow through the very person it nearly destroys. So, if seeing everything has a cost, how do you stop paying it? Jung hinted at an answer through his own breakdown. When the flood of visions overwhelmed him, he didn't suppress them. He met them. He recorded every dream, every image, every voice in what became the Red Book. He said, I was menaced by a psychosis and was saved only by my ability to understand what was happening. Understanding, not avoidance, saved him. He learned that perception without integration is chaos, but perception with consciousness becomes wisdom. You stop paying the cost when you stop identifying with what you perceive. When you realize you are not the mirror, you are the awareness behind it. But let's pause, because this idea that you can integrate perception sounds nice on paper. In reality, it's brutal work. Integration means confronting not only what you see in others, but what those perceptions awaken in you. When you notice someone's deceit, you must ask, what part of me deceives? When you sense another's jealousy, you must examine your own hidden envy. Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That's the trap and the key. Because when you refuse this reflection, your gift turns against you. Your clarity becomes judgment. Your empathy becomes resentment. And your perception, instead of liberating you, isolates you completely. There's a reason Jung said superior perception must be humbled, because seeing clearly doesn't make you wise. It makes you responsible. Imagine this. You walk through life seeing the patterns, the psychological games, the lies, the projections. You can name them all. But the more you name, the less you feel human connection. You become the observer of humanity, not part of it. And that, Jung realized, is the most subtle form of ego inflation. When perception becomes identity, when you start believing you're different because you can see what others can't. That's not individuation. That's isolation disguised as insight. Because true individuation isn't about separation. It's about becoming conscious while remaining connected. So, let's bring this back to real life. To you, listening right now. If you're the kind of person who notices everything, who feels drained after being around others, who carries emotional residue that isn't yours, you're not broken. You're perceptive, but you're untrained. Your nervous system is tuned to frequencies that most people never hear. And if you don't learn to regulate it, you'll keep paying the cost in exhaustion, confusion, and loneliness. The path forward begins not with dulling your perception, but grounding it. You stop being overwhelmed when you give what you see a place to go. Writing, art, solitude, silence. Jung told his patients to spend time every day in solitude, not to escape the world, but to let the absorbed material settle. Only in stillness can you separate what belongs to you from what you've absorbed. Without solitude, your psyche becomes a crowded house of other people's emotions. But the deeper challenge is what Jung called conscious discrimination. It's the ability to say, this emotion is mine, that one is not. This anxiety belongs to me, that one belongs to the person beside me. It sounds simple. It's not. Because perception doesn't come with labels. You feel everything as you. That's why individuation, Jung's core process, is the only sustainable path. It's not self-improvement. It's self-differentiation. Learning where you end and others begin. Only then can you see without being swallowed. Only then can you empathize without absorbing. Only then can your gift become medicine instead of poison. You see, Jung believed that highly perceptive individuals were the early carriers of the living spirit, what he called consciousness pioneers. But pioneers always bleed first. They enter uncharted territories of awareness without maps, without companions, without recognition. And yet, he said, their suffering matters. Because the consciousness they develop individually becomes what society needs collectively, decades later. So if you feel isolated by your perception, remember, you're not behind, you're ahead. The world doesn't yet understand your way of seeing, but it will. Your task is not to dim your perception. Your task is to become strong enough to carry it. Because the cost of seeing everything isn't the perception itself. It's the lack of integration. It's the absence of boundaries. It's the loneliness of being a mirror that no one dares look into. But once you learn to separate what you see from who you are, the cost changes. It stops being suffering and starts becoming service. Because when you learn to hold perception consciously, you stop being overwhelmed by what you notice and start transforming it into wisdom. You become what Jung called a vessel for consciousness, not a sponge, a vessel. A sponge absorbs, a vessel contains. That's the turning point. When your empathy no longer drains you, when your clarity no longer isolates you, when you can walk through human darkness and still keep your light steady. But we're not there yet. Because before integration comes confrontation. Before wisdom comes disillusionment. You will lose relationships. You will question your sanity. You will envy those who can live unaware. You will want to trade perception for peace. And you can't. Because awareness is irreversible. Once you've seen through the mask, you can't go back to pretending it's real. So the only path left is to learn how to see wisely. From here, the path turns inward, into the quiet work of living with awareness. Learning how to build boundaries that don't harden you, how to turn empathy into clear vision, and how to transform the pain of perception into something that gives you power and purpose. Because the goal isn't to stop seeing, it's to stop suffering for what you see. When Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, It will direct your life, and you will call it fate. He wasn't speaking to ordinary minds. He was speaking to those who see too much. Because once you start noticing the hidden architecture behind people's choices, you realize fate is often just unexamined psychology repeating itself. And that realization is both freedom and burden. You can't unknow what you see. You can't blame the world for what you understand too clearly. And yet, you can't turn that awareness off either. So the question becomes, how do you live with the gift of perception without being consumed by it? How do you stay human when you can see through every disguise? Jung's answer began with something most people misunderstand: boundaries. He said that boundaries are not barriers. They are containers for consciousness. They don't close you off from the world. They keep your perception from leaking into everything you touch. He told his intuitive patients, you must learn to carry the unconscious without being carried away by it. That's the work. You don't suppress your perception, you contain it. You stop being a sponge and start becoming a vessel. It sounds simple, but it begins in the smallest moments. You walk into a conversation and feel the temperature shift before anyone speaks. Someone's angry, but smiling. Someone's afraid, but acting brave. And without meaning to, you start absorbing it all. That's the moment to pause, to take one slow breath and ask silently, what here actually belongs to me? That single question begins to separate you from what you perceive. It's how you remind your psyche that you are allowed to witness without becoming what you witness. Jung called this discrimination of contents. Not judgment, but sorting, knowing what's yours and what's not. Then comes the medicine of solitude, not the lonely kind, but the kind that recalibrates. Jung insisted that intuitive people must spend time alone each day, not to analyze, not to escape, but to let the inner noise settle. Because without silence, the intuitive mind becomes a crowded marketplace of other people's feelings. Stillness allows your psyche to breathe again. It lets absorbed emotions fall away until your own voice can be heard beneath the noise. But solitude has to be handled carefully. Because if you mistake silence for safety, it becomes isolation. And isolation, Jung warned, can wear the mask of enlightenment. You start believing you're beyond people, when in truth, you're just tired of being misunderstood. That's not wisdom. It's fatigue disguised as insight. So, solitude must be balanced with connection, not with crowds, but with a few who can see you clearly without fear. Even one soul who understands your language is enough to keep you human. And when solitude and connection find their balance, you begin the deeper work, shadow integration. Because perception without shadow work turns toxic. The clearer you see others, the more dangerous it becomes to ignore your own darkness. Jung noticed this again and again in his patients. They could see everyone else's hidden motives, but were blind to their own. He warned that the greatest danger was identifying with the superior function, believing that because you see clearly, you are beyond what you see. But no one is beyond the unconscious, not even those who study it, especially not those who study it. So, when someone's dishonesty disgusts you, pause and ask, where do I hide my own truth? When someone's arrogance triggers you, ask, what part of me still needs to prove itself? Every irritation, Jung said, is a mirror held up to the unlived parts of yourself. And the moment you stop using perception to judge and start using it to integrate, your awareness softens. It becomes cleaner. You start to see through compassion instead of criticism. Then comes the subtle mastery of perception, the ability to see without reacting, to witness someone's pain without rushing to fix it, to recognize manipulation without falling into battle, to hold truth without needing to announce it. Because most intuitive people suffer not from what they see, but from believing they must act on everything they see. They turn perception into obligation, and that's how empathy becomes exhaustion. Jung said, "The task is not to cure, but to relate." You are not responsible for every unconscious pattern you recognize. Sometimes, your only task is to see it clearly, to understand it, and let it pass. That is conscious participation, to be among others without being swallowed by their inner worlds. You stay aware, but you remain yourself. Yet awareness has its own temptations. Once you realize how much you perceive, it's easy to become inflated by it. You start thinking you're special, more evolved, more awake. You begin to diagnose everyone silently, to believe you're the observer and everyone else is asleep. But Jung called that state the most dangerous form of possession. Inflation of the ego by the archetype. He said, the moment you believe yourself to be the bearer of absolute truth, you are possessed by the very forces you claim to see. That's when clarity becomes pride, and pride cuts you off from real relationship. So humility isn't self-denial, it's realism. It's knowing that perception doesn't make you superior, it makes you responsible. Your task isn't to prove that you see, it's to stay kind even when you do. Seeing clearly without love, Jung said, is the same as blindness, because clarity without compassion is cruelty disguised as intelligence. So, stay humble, stay kind, and most importantly, stay grounded. That's why Jung always brought his patients back to the body. He said consciousness must stay anchored in physical reality, because when perception floats too high, it starts inventing meaning faster than truth can form. So touch the world, walk, breathe, do something with your hands. Let the physical hold what the psychic can't, and then create. Jung believed creativity was a sacred act. He drew, he painted, he wrote dialogues with his own soul. He knew that perception, when unexpressed, turns poisonous. Expression turns it into art, and art turns it into understanding. Write down what you feel. Paint what you can't explain. Symbolize what overwhelms you, because the moment you give it form, it stops haunting you. When your perception becomes image, you reclaim authorship of your inner world. And yet, even after grounding and creating, there remains the hardest part, reconnection. Because after years of being misunderstood, many perceptive people start hiding. They shrink to survive. They stop speaking truth because they've learned how easily it burns others. But hiding your perception doesn't protect you. It only starves you. So you must learn how to share it wisely, gradually, gently. Jung called this measured revelation. You offer what you see in small pieces, watch how people respond, and increase depth only with those who can bear it. Truth must be offered in proportion to another person's readiness. Too much light too soon feels like attack. So you don't impose awareness. You invite it. Speak softly. Observe deeply. Let your insight feel like empathy, not exposure. Because when people feel safe in your presence, your perception begins to heal instead of threaten. Still, even with all of this, there will be days when the sensitivity feels unbearable. When you trade awareness for ignorance in a heartbeat. When your empathy feels more like punishment than gift. On those days, remember Jung's own words. There were things in me which I did not produce, but which produced themselves and had their own life. He learned that what he feared most, the chaos of seeing too much, was actually his psyche trying to grow. Transformation never feels gentle. It feels like losing control. But beneath the chaos, A deeper order is forming. Every time perception overwhelms you, consciousness expands a little further. It's not a breakdown. It's growth disguised as crisis. And when that realization sinks in, something changes. You stop fearing your perception. You stop trying to manage it like an illness. You begin to trust it. You recognize that the gift will always have weight, but that weight can become strength if you learn how to carry it consciously. That's the real meaning of individuation. Not escaping the unconscious world, but learning to live inside it without losing yourself. You don't disappear into the crowd. You don't float above it. You walk through it awake. Because being awake is not about knowing everything. It's about being able to bear what you know and stay gentle anyway. And that is how you begin to stop paying the cost. At some point, when the noise settles, you stop fighting your perception. You stop wishing to be normal. You stop apologizing for how deeply you feel and start asking what this sensitivity was meant to teach you. That's the shift Jung waited his entire life to describe. The moment awareness stops being a wound and becomes a kind of sight. Not the kind that sees through people, but the kind that sees into them and keeps loving them anyway. Because that's the final form of perception. Not exposure, not defense, but understanding. Jung called it the individuation of the perceiver. The point when consciousness becomes compassionate, because it's finally whole enough not to need protection. You realize that you don't have to turn your light down for anyone. You just have to learn how to hold it without burning yourself. Many people think awareness means seeing more. But Jung discovered it's actually about seeing differently. It's not the quantity of perception, but the quality of presence. The truly conscious person doesn't stare harder. They breathe slower. They listen deeper. They can stand in the presence of contradiction without needing to fix it. And that's what makes them powerful. Their ability to stay soft in the face of truth. You see, consciousness is not about collecting insights. It's about increasing your capacity to stay human in the middle of them. And once that happens, seeing everything no longer hurts the same way. You begin to notice the pattern beneath the chaos, the lesson inside the pain, the meaning woven through the suffering. That's when perception becomes wisdom. Jung said that those who carry deep perception stand slightly ahead of collective consciousness. They feel what others will later understand. They sense what society will only discover decades later. He called them carriers of the living spirit. They are not prophets or saints. They are simply those who have suffered enough to become clear. Their nervous systems are tuned to the frequencies of tomorrow. And that's why it hurts to live in today. If you feel like your mind works in layers that others don't even perceive exist, it's because your perception is evolutionary. You're built to translate the unconscious into awareness. That's why Jung said the highly perceptive individual isn't abnormal. They're transitional. They stand at the border between who we are and who we're becoming. But the challenge of standing at that edge is that it's lonely there. No one waits for you. No one explains how to live with it, and so you must become your own translator. The loneliness of awareness isn't proof that you're broken. It's the silence that comes before understanding arrives. Jung wrote, "The individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit." There is no collective consciousness without individual transformation. That means your integration matters. Every time you make peace with something you see, you make it a little easier for the rest of the world to face it too. When you stop projecting your shadow and start owning it, you remove one more piece of blindness from the human field. When you learn to hold both empathy and boundary, you teach others that sensitivity can coexist with strength. That's how collective consciousness evolves, not through revolutions, but through individual revelations. At some point, you realize You don't need to speak everything you perceive. You don't need to announce truth like a warning. You can just live it quietly. Because when perception integrates, it stops needing recognition. It just is. You walk into a room and feel everything, but it doesn't destabilize you. You notice dishonesty, but it doesn't provoke you. You sense projection, but you don't absorb it. That's not detachment. That's mastery. Jung described this stage as the transcendent function, when the opposites inside you learn to coexist without conflict. Awareness and compassion, empathy and boundary, solitude and connection. When that balance arrives, you stop being pulled between extremes. You begin to live from the center, and that center is peace. But peace isn't numbness. It's presence. It's the ability to face what is without needing it to be something else. Most people confuse numbness for calm. But numbness is a deadened state, the absence of response. Peace, on the other hand, is full aliveness without reaction. It's being able to stand in the storm and still breathe slowly. When perception ripens into peace, it becomes gentle. It no longer cuts through people. It holds them. It no longer exposes. It reveals softly. And that's when you realize that your perception was never meant to isolate you. It was meant to teach you how to love consciously, because love without consciousness is possession, and consciousness without love is cruelty. But together, they become clarity with warmth. Jung once said that what we call fate is simply the parts of ourselves we haven't made conscious yet. And those who see too much are simply living that process ahead of time. You notice patterns in others because you've begun to notice them in yourself. You sense collective anxiety because it's the echo of your own unhealed tension. You feel the world's contradictions because you're learning to hold your own. That's the secret. Your perception isn't just about others. It's a mirror for your own evolution. Every insight you have about the world is also a message from your unconscious about what you're ready to face next. That's why the sensitive person's life feels like therapy even when they're not in one, because reality keeps talking back to them through symbols, through coincidences, through pain. Jung called this synchronicity the language of meaning that connects inner and outer worlds. Once you start listening, you realize the world was never against you. It was always teaching you. Still, let's be honest. Even integration doesn't remove the weight completely. There are days when the empathy feels endless, when people's projections land like arrows, when your heart feels overused. On those days, Jung's advice was simple. Return to the small things, the everyday rituals that keep the soul connected to earth. He said, the small things of life were what saved me. Make tea, water a plant, watch the sky, talk to someone without analyzing them. Let life be small again, because perception expands endlessly, but peace grows in the details. You don't have to understand everything you feel. You just have to let it move through you without resistance. That's the quiet form of wisdom Jung lived by. He didn't conquer his visions. He learned to walk alongside them. When perception stops demanding to be useful, it becomes beautiful. It stops being a weapon against illusion and starts being an instrument of connection. You begin to realize that everyone, even those who frustrate you, is carrying some form of unconscious pain. And that insight softens judgment. It replaces superiority with empathy. You stop needing to fix people and start respecting their timing. You stop arguing with shadows and start recognizing how long it takes for consciousness to ripen. That's when your perception becomes love in disguise. Not romantic love, but the kind of love that allows people to be exactly where they are, without pretending they're somewhere else. That's the medicine your gift was meant to bring. Not awareness that divides, but awareness that unites. One day, you'll look back and realize the things that once felt like curses were initiations. The times you were misunderstood taught you to trust your inner voice. The moments you were overwhelmed taught you to build boundaries. The heartbreaks taught you to see without attachment. Every cost you paid was a lesson in how to see without losing yourself. That's how perception becomes evolution. That's how you stop paying for it. And maybe that's how you start living for it. Jung wrote near the end of his life, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." You were not meant to become a victim of awareness. You were meant to become its expression. To turn perception into art, empathy into clarity, and consciousness into compassion. You don't have to save the world. You just have to stay awake in it, because every awake person makes the world a little less blind. And maybe that's the real reward for paying the cost all these years. You've been preparing to carry the light that others still fear to touch. Now you know how. So walk forward, see clearly, feel deeply, speak softly, and live as if your perception is not a burden but a gift. The world hasn't learned how to name yet, because that's what it is.